Well, here we are back again for another set of NHL Power Rankings with the top 10 teams in the NHL through 4 weeks of the 23-24 season. And I'll be honest right up front, if you saw my Power Rankings for last week and are returning, there's not a whole lot of change to this list when it comes to at least the teams on the list from last week with just the one newcomer. But there has been a decent amount of shakeup with where those teams are at on the list. And if you're brand new and this is the first one of these you're seeing, well, it'll all be new to you. I suppose also if you're new, as a quick reminder, or I guess it can't really be a reminder if this is the first time you're here, but either way, I do just do the top 10 teams on these power rankings each week rather than the full 32 for a variety of reasons. One, it allows me to spend a little bit more time with each team. Also, let's face it, the people most likely to watch these videos are fans of the teams playing better, and at least theoretically, it saves on time. With that being the case, let's waste no more of that and get right into it. So we jump right into the section where I let myself cheat a little bit and have a couple of honorable mentions before jumping right into the top 10. And this week, as a newcomer to these honorable mentions, I have the New York Islanders, who are starting to do kind of Islanders-y things. Islanders-y things. Anyway, they're not letting teams score a lot of goals, and they're starting to actually get some wins out of it. They're still classically 500 in that they've won 5 games and lost 5, but they've only lost 2 of their 5 losses in regulation, so their record looks a lot better with the way the NHL does things. And again, they're starting to win the way that the Islanders tend to win when things are going well, by not allowing opponents to score a whole heck of a lot. Either way, at least to me anyway, they certainly are one of these teams that's right on the bubble of the top 10, and if they start to pick things up and get some more consistent wins rather than overtime losses, they'll certainly find their way into the top 10, and that would probably be not too hard for them to make happen if, say, Sorokin starts getting a little bit more towards typical Sorokin form rather than NHL average. And then the second team that I have here as an honorable mention for the 3rd week running is the Carolina Hurricanes. They once again just end up outside my top 10. They do pick up 2 wins, 1 loss, but neither win was particularly impressive. They do beat the Islanders, who I just mentioned, but that was in overtime. Other than that, they beat a Flyers team that's starting to look more like the Flyers we expected coming into the season, and they had a loss between those 2 games. So just not quite enough to bounce into the top 10. I was actually going to put them in the 10th spot, though, if it wasn't for the win on Sunday night of the team that has jumped into that 10th spot. That, of course, would be a team that, I'll be honest, I did not expect to see in this top 10 list at any point during the course of this season. But here they are, the Anaheim Ducks. Now, for the Ducks, winning 6 straight and capping it off with a regulation win over the last team that hadn't lost in regulation in the Vegas Golden Knights will certainly earn you a spot in the top 10. Of course, even with that said, there were people in last week's comments that were saying that even at that point, the Ducks deserved at least an honorable mention with how things were going. And I'm sure those probably Duck fans will not necessarily be happy that after how things have continued to go, that they're still just in this 10th spot. And I can't really blame you if you're a Ducks fan and want to be happy about how things are going. You have every right to. But at the same time, this is still a team that lost 4 of their first 5 in regulation. So I'm still not necessarily sold that this is something that's going to continue over the course of the season. But I couldn't snub them from the list after especially beating Vegas here on Sunday night. And I'm not just saying that I'm not convinced that they can continue doing this because people didn't have expectations of them coming into the season. It's also because even with the 6-game winning streak, a lot of which have been 1 or the last one 2-goal games, the only one that was a 3-goal win was over Philadelphia, and we've already talked about the issues they've had of late. But otherwise, in most statistical categories, and certainly most of the major ones, this is pretty much a league average team, which is a lot better than most people expected. There's not necessarily anything statistically anyway that really stands out as exceptional about this team or top 10 necessarily. That having been said, when you do hand the Bruins their first loss of the season in overtime and then hand Vegas their first loss in regulation, it certainly can't be ignored. And for what it's worth, with their next 3 games coming up this week being against Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and San Jose, there's a decent chance they'll still be on this top 10 list come this time next week. Up next in the 9th spot, and a team that I nearly kept in their spot from last week in favor of putting the Ducks in this 9th spot, I have the Detroit Red Wings, who pretty much jumped up to 9 because of their most recent win also being a very impressive win as a kind of answer to the way the Ducks finished against Vegas, as Detroit finished their week by defeating the Bruins, handing them their first regulation loss. As far as why I didn't move them up further with that win at the end of the week, That would largely be because their first two games of the week were not terribly impressive. They had an overtime win against the Islanders, which is still a pretty good win against a team that has already been mentioned in this video. But then they got shut out 2-0 against a Panthers team that I would expect to get better as the season goes along, but has had a rocky start to the season. And I suppose I should also probably mention, even if it's kind of ping-ponging back and forth here a little bit, but another reason that I had them here at 9 rather than the Ducks in 9 and them in 10 is because, unlike the Ducks, they do actually have a part of their game so far this season that still stands out as a top 10 aspect of their game, specifically their ability to put pucks in the net, where they're top 10 still on the power play. It's probably being carried a bit by the incredibly hot start to the season they had, but still top 10, and also top 10, sixth actually overall in the NHL when it comes to goals for per game, which, yeah, they got shut out once this week, but they still managed to score 9 goals in 3 games. So a team that can score even if it disappeared for the one game against Florida. Then in the 8th spot is a team that, honestly, I thought hard about dropping farther and probably would have if it wasn't for the talent of this roster and the fact that I strongly believe they'll spend most of the season in this top 10 once they get whatever is going on figured out. But they do continue to slowly drop down these rankings week after week, that being the Colorado Avalanche, who only played 2 games this week, and that's probably a good part of why they're still on this top 10 list, and they did win one of those 2, but they finished, or their second of those 2, I should say, was a 7-0 loss at the hands of the Golden Knights. And that's bad in its own right, but it also doesn't look great when it's one now of 3 shutout losses in their last 4 games. So kind of an opposite start to the season of what the Ducks have going on, where they started the season 6-0, which is what's carrying them still in these top 10 rankings at this point, and now again have lost 3 of the last 4 in shutout fashion. And I said last week that the back-to-back 4-0 shutout losses were concerning in the time, but they probably wouldn't get shut out all that many more times over the course of the season. Well, here we are a week later, and they've already gotten shut out one more time. And I suppose if you wanted to be really optimistic about things, if you're going to lose 7-0, Vegas is probably the most understandable team to lose by that score to, but there's no team that wants to be losing 7-0 to any team in the league. San Jose might actually take a 7-0 loss at this point, but other than them, yeah, 7-0 doesn't look good regardless of who the opponent is. And for the Avs, their one win in those last 4 games is a 4-1 win, so a pretty decent win, but it's over a not terribly impressive Blues team. So while I wouldn't necessarily still say that I would be concerned as an Avs fan, as somebody who was an Avs fan for a while until Seattle got a team, I would definitely be feeling frustrated with how things are going right now. Up next in the 7th spot, and moving down 3 spots from last week, I have the New Jersey Devils, who largely moved down that much, which does seem a bit drastic, but it's mostly due to some other teams that were below them getting hot and jumping past them, as they still went 2-1 on the week, but their one loss was a 4-1 loss to the St. Louis Blues, who I just said haven't been terribly impressive. And while I really try not to let injuries affect the power rankings too much until they, affect how the team is performing on the ice, losing Jack Hughes is not ideal, to say the least, for however much time he misses. And besides, even though they did win the 2 games on either side of that loss to St. Louis, neither one was terribly impressive either. They won 5-3 over Minnesota, so that's a decent win against a Minnesota team that also has kind of had a rocky start, but I think will get better as the season goes along. And then a 4-3 win here on Sunday against Chicago, who have, kind of like the Flyers, started to look a little bit more like the Chicago team we expected, rather than the one we saw through the first few games. But the Devils then, and Avs for that matter, the game coming up on Tuesday between the two teams will be an interesting one, and it will be interesting to see if the Devils can continue their torrid pace of scoring goals with Jack Hughes out week to week. Obviously, this team is off to an insanely hot start on the power play, 43%, which you'd have to imagine is going to come down to some point as the season goes along, but an incredible start on the power play, first ranked in the NHL by a decent margin, and are still top 4 in goals for per game. The ability to prevent goals from going into their net is still a work in progress, which is the part that leaves a little bit of questions with the absence of Hughes of whether or not the Devils can prevent enough goals going into their net with the likely drop in offensive production. Still, this is a very good team, and I wouldn't imagine them dropping all the way out of the top 10, but I wouldn't have imagined the Avs would get shut out 3 out of 4 games, so anything can happen in this league. In the 6th spot, I have a team that I'm actually going to make a last-second switch here between 5 and 6. So now in 6th, I'm going to go with the Dallas Stars, in part because the team that I'm now bumping up to 5th didn't lose a game this week, while the Stars did finish their week even if they played 4 games, so a pretty busy week for the Stars. But their last one of the week, they did lose 2-0 in shutout fashion to a good team in the Canucks, but still, they finished their week with a loss, and even at that, their first 3 games of the week, while they did win all 3 of them, were close games over Columbus and then the 2 Alberta teams, none of whom, as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, have gotten off to particularly great starts to their seasons. At least for the Stars, though, they did win all of the games that they should win, and also importantly, started to get their offense going a little bit with 5 goals against Columbus and then 4 against each of the Alberta teams, which that was the part of the game for the Stars that had been lacking even in spite of their early success this season. And then, of course, against a good team, it starts to bring doubt again when they get shut out by the Canucks. I suppose, at least for the Stars, though, those 13 goals they did score in the first 3 games of the week were enough to bounce their offense up from bad to below average so far this season when it comes to goals for per game. And at least in goals against, they're still a top 5 team at keeping the puck out of their own net. And Ottinger continues to be one of the best goaltenders in the NHL here in the early part of the season. And it is because of kind of a mix of those 2 things, the fantastic goaltending that they're getting from Ottinger, which seems like the logical next step in his progression after a great start to his career, that he would get better as time goes along, so that seems sustainable. And then you would also think that the offense that started off very slow for this team would eventually pick up, and this team would be a very difficult team to beat, and it seemed like that's what was happening in the early part of this week. That having been said, the shutout again against the Canucks does bring a little bit of doubt into it after playing not great teams to start the week. Then you finally face a good team and don't score. Their next game coming up here against the Bruins could be a very telling one of whether or not that offense was just a product of the teams they are playing against, or if they finally figured out a way to start putting pucks in the net, and the Vancouver game is a write-off. So then in that 5th spot, and honestly, I don't know why I didn't have them there in the first place. I could see an argument for moving them higher up, and I'm sure the fans of their team would probably think that's where they belong. But I have the LA Kings coming off of a perfect 3-0 week, winning 4-1 against Toronto, then 3-2 over Ottawa, which and Ottawa's had their issues on and off the ice, and then finished up their week with a 5-0 win over the Flyers. And again, granted, it's the Flyers, and it seems like they're finally starting to show their slightly darker colors of not being a particularly great team, but it's still a 5-0 win, and that's a good win pretty much regardless of who the opponent is. Might be a little bit disappointing if it's, say, San Jose, but everyone else in the league, that's a win that you're going to be happy with coming out of it. And I do think that it's especially relevant to the Kings, with the big question mark here being the goaltending, that they finished the week with a shutout after giving up just 3 goals in the first 2 games. So for those that aren't math majors, that's just a goal per game in 3 games this week, 3 wins. And well, Talbot had a fantastic week. I say the weakness is goaltending. If Talbot keeps playing the way he is so far to start the season, we won't be talking about that as a weakness for very much longer. That having been said, Phoenix Copley has not had a particularly good first 3 games of his season, so if Talbot does suffer an injury at some point, those questions are going to come right back in a hurry. At least for now, though, the structure the Kings are playing with in front of it does allow some success in net for Talbot, and also is getting them enough points at the other end that it's going to make up for it more nights than not. And in fact, when it comes to how things are going for the Kings at that end of the ice, they just have 1 team above them in the entire NHL when it comes to goals for per game. And things are going a lot better on the power play for that team than they are for the Kings, which means this might just be the best, at least offensive anyway, 5-on-5 team that the NHL has to offer at this point in the season. And that is a lot more sustainable than, say, scoring over 40% on the power play is. Either way, if the Kings can continue this amount of offense, even if they just get NHL average goaltending from Talbot or whoever they have in net, they're going to win the vast majority of their games and will definitely be in the playoffs come the end of the season in one of those 3 Pacific Division spots. Granted, the Pacific Division is pretty much heavily divided down the middle at this point. Of course, though, that one team that I said was above the Kings in goals for per game also happens to be in their division and also happens to be in the spot just above them in these power rankings. At 4th, I have the Vancouver Canucks. And honestly, I could see a pretty good argument for putting them up in the 3rd spot because not only are they the best in goals for per game, which, is probably the most important offensive stat because goals are what win you games, which is helped out by being 4th in the league on power play at 30%. But they're also 2nd in the NHL in goals against per game, as Demko has really come into his own or gotten back maybe to what the Canucks expected when they picked him over Markstrom a few years back, as he, coming off of an incredibly strong week that he played all 3 games of and won all 3, might just be the leading Vezina candidate at this point early on in the season, the best goaltender the NHL has to offer. I mean, he was already doing pretty well to start the season coming into this week, and then this week had 2 goals allowed against the Predators, then just 1 against the Sharks, although it is the Sharks, and if you let up more than 1, that's kind of a problem in its own right, but then very much finished off strong by helping to shut out the Stars. So then in the end with this team, you're left with potentially the best goaltender in the NHL to this point, the best offense in the NHL to this point, even if it was helped out a little bit with a 10-goal performance against the Sharks. And yeah, 10 goals seems great, but then the very next game, the Sharks gave up 10 again, so it might just be that they're that bad. Either way, the combination of that great of goaltending and that good of offense is going to win you a lot of games, and again, I could see a good argument for having the Canucks even higher up on this list. Heck, things are going so well for this team at this point that even Tyler Myers doesn't look like a total bum out on the ice. Moving on though to the 3rd spot is a team that definitely didn't have nearly as impressive a week as the Canucks, but they also aren't moving up from the 9th spot on my list to the 4th spot like the Canucks did. They're staying right where they were last week. It's the New York Rangers. Now for the Rangers, they did win 2 and lost 1, the 1 loss coming in overtime, but to a Minnesota Wild team that's had a shaky start. And one of their wins was also in overtime to another team that hasn't been doing amazing in the Winnipeg Jets. So really for the Rangers, there's not a whole lot more to say about this team that I didn't say last week. It was a pretty business-like week for them, certainly not as impressive, like I already said, as some of the other teams that jumped up in the standings below them, but they still get 5 out of 6 potential points. They continue to churn forward with a league average-ish offense, but still one of the best power plays the league has to offer, and are one of the best teams at keeping the puck out of their net as the tandem of Shesterkin and Quick continues to serve them well. So until they give me a reason to think otherwise, this is probably the next best team to the top 2. And when it comes to those 2 teams, again, there's no movement here at the top, so sorry if I'm being boring, but in the 2nd spot, I have the Boston Bruins. They do get 2 wins before losing their first game in regulation to the Red Wings. Still a 5-4 loss, so not a terrible loss there by any means. The 2 wins, though, are still ones that took them extra time to get over Toronto and Florida. Neither one of them are in this top 10 list. Toronto falling out of it because of a terrible week, but Florida, a bit of a rocky season. Either way, again, for the Bruins, you get 2 points in the standings. That's really all you're looking for. And at least the game against Toronto, they played well enough probably to win that game in regulation. Either way, though, ultimately, it's pretty much splitting hairs between the 2 teams here at the top. Because in that first spot, and again, sorry to not give the Bruins too much time, but there's really not a lot to add to where things are at with them right now. They continue to be great at goaltending, defense, and still scoring more than enough to get wins with whatever small number of goals they give up. Anyway, in that first spot, by process of elimination, you have whoever's playing the San Jose Sharks. No, I'm just kidding. It's the Vegas Golden Knights. They do end up losing their first game in regulation to finish off the week here on Sunday night to that Ducks team that jumped into the top 10. But otherwise, it was another solid week for them, winning 3 games. So a busy week for the team that's already played the most games in the NHL. and with that has won now 11 of their first 13. And with those 3 wins, even if, like with the Bruins, it did take them extra time to get the first one with a, at that point, second straight shootout win, this time over Montreal, they did get their next 2 wins on the week over Winnipeg and then the 7-0 win over Colorado, both those wins in regulation. So unfortunately, as someone who's not the biggest fan of them, it does seem like for the defending champs, it's still all systems online, full steam ahead, as they are the 5th best offense in the NHL at this point, and the 4th best when it comes to goals against per game, so still top 5 in both of those important categories, and they probably have the best goaltending tandem that the NHL has to offer, with both Hill and Thompson having fantastic starts to their season and being among the league's best, both of them. So even if one of them were to get injured, which is something that Vegas has had a history of having trouble keeping goaltenders healthy, well, they've got a safety net of following up one of the better goaltenders in the NHL with another one of the NHL's better goaltenders. And to be perfectly honest, unless they lose their next game coming up here against the Kings, I don't see them moving out of this top spot come this time next week, considering the only other game that they play in this next week is against the San Jose Sharks, and that very well may be the game that forces the NHL to institute some sort of mercy rule. Guess we'll just have to see how ugly that one gets, but Vegas solidly in this top spot. I know I said splitting hairs, and Boston is really close, so if Boston wins out, which given how things are going is not terribly unlikely, and the Golden Knights do manage to lose against the Kings. I mean, if they lose against the Sharks, they're moving down regardless of what else happens. But if they lose against the Kings, Boston wins out, then I could see swapping the 2. Otherwise, these top 2 are pretty much locked in at 1 and 2, at least for the time being. And so there you have it, the top 10 teams through 4 weeks of the 23-24 NHL season. I'd love to know what your thoughts are down in the comment section below, who your top 10 is. Vancouver fans, feel free to tell me why I'm wrong and Vancouver's actually the number 1 team in the NHL. But anyway, other than that, if you have made it to this point, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video and would like to see more, there are free ways to help support the channel down below by clicking like or subscribe that I would appreciate you using. And until next time, stay safe out there, be good to each other, God bless, and I mean, I'd love to see the Kraken in this top 10, but it's probably not going to happen, not for a while.